Hi, everybody. Good to be here. I see it's still windy, so that's going to make some determination about what I'm going to read. But I'm going to start off with some pieces that actually is located or about Florida. And this is because even though I'm from upstate New York, and my sister is from upstate New York, and my niece is from upstate New York, both my parents came from Florida. They fled in the late 40s for upstate New York. So my father's family comes from around the Tampa area, and my mother's family comes from around the Gainesville area. And there are still Eadys in that area somewhere. I ran to one of them a few years ago. So I'm going to read some stuff from Florida. And this is the first one. It's going to be about my sister, who just died recently, died on July 7th. When she left, like I said, she grew up in Florida. She was born in Rochester, but went back down to Gainesville for a few years. Florida. Years later, as an unwed mother, partly to escape her daughter Marie, my big sister Gloria will move down to my mother's hometown in Gainesville, Florida. And when she does, no one will make sport of her because she grew up in the North. In fact, she will fit in and stay for years. The reason for this is while my parents' house might sit in upstate New York, the truth of the matter is we were raised in Florida. The smells rising from the skillets, Florida. The car parts on the lawn, Florida. The switch across the legs, Florida. The fact was that we resided in the deep black South, even when we were walking around in a blizzard or sitting at a lunch counter without giving it a second thought. The dry barbecue pit in the backyard, Florida. The black cats and the ghosts, Florida. The sunflowers in the front yard and the collard greens in the back, Florida. And in the house next door, maybe Georgia, maybe the Carolinas. And in the house in the middle of the block, maybe Alabama, maybe Texas. That boyfriend who keeps his conked hair in a net, maybe that's Memphis, maybe that's Louisiana. The pig's knuckles and the pickled eggs, the hot combs and the Holy Ghost, that's where we actually lived up north. And that's what the neighbors see when my sister steps off the Greyhound. She is poor but well-dressed. Her trunk might be dented, but the clothes inside of it are clean. Although I'm not there to see it, I know whenever a fool approaches, he is saluted with a black woman's cackle. This is her passport, and everybody on her new block stamps it. Now that one and some, maybe one or two others come from an unpublished memoir I've been working on forever. And I finally got a title for it. I'm going to call it Kid Life. The most writing I've done all year. But I'm going to read something in honor of my friend Ron. I'm going to read something off my phone. If you were here for the talk yesterday, you know what the gag is here, right? And this is an unpublished poem that I found while I was looking for stuff this morning. Like I said, my mother grew up in Gainesville, and my parents met in Rochester, and then they broke up briefly. My mother went back down to Gainesville for a few years and didn't work out. She came back to Rochester and lived with my father for the rest of her life. But I was trying to write a cycle of poems about that time when she separated from my father and then came back. Never finished it, but this is the first piece in that cycle. And this comes from just me, just interviewing her. I'm editing it, of course. The 3 hours, ours. You want to know what books I read when I was a young girl. I suppose that's because that's how you make your living. But it wasn't like it is now, you know. Back then, books were something you got to keep. We only had the one school. It was owned by a black man who came back south when he got out of college. I remember they said he paid to put it up. It was his own school. Thought it was a shame black children couldn't go to Alachua for school. Before that, we didn't have nothing. Then it was Mr. Johnson. I believe his name was Mr. Johnson. But we couldn't take the books home, and they weren't storybooks anyway. It was mostly how to write and how to count. Mr. Johnson thought that was important. It was different than what you had. We didn't have no books at home. Something happened to that man, and he was young, too. One day, school was late. We were waiting out the window, looking for him. Then this lady came in, said, "Mr. Johnson, he's not coming back." We knew he was dead by the way she said it. Some children tried to ask, but the other children just hussed them up, said he was a haint, a ghost, just walking around. They didn't want him to hear us talking about him. That lady was our new teacher, and she didn't want to talk about it. The grown people were speaking all hushed. I never did know what happened. I think he went to one of those black colleges. Then he came back to Burness Lake. A lot of those people just stayed up north after they got out of college. We didn't have money to spend on books. Your grandmother worked then, and she'd leave me with a washerwoman, and she'd sit me down on a stump where she could see me. She'd want me like one of her wet shirts if I moved. "Better not make me come looking for you, Albeita." I didn't have any books to pass the time. Mr. Johnson just wanted you to learn how to read and write your name real good. Then nobody could come along and take advantage. And the next piece I'm going to read is about my dad. Well, I think it's about hold on. It is about my dad, hold on. And it's in this book. And oh, no. It's hard to keep these things straight. The story is, no, it's in this one. The story is, if I can find it, if it's actually here. Yep, it's here. The story is, my father grew up around Tampa, and what he would do, this is the only story he told me about my grandfather. And, my father, of course, and I had, a lot of tension, as they say, about me being a writer. King Snake. Sometimes, my father's young life would resemble something you'd hear in a Muddy Waters song. Like the time he found out that the local hospitals would pay good money for rattlesnakes in order to make anti-venom. Soon, he had a pen full. And I want to imagine my non-body, he's yet to be, whispering careful in his ear as he seeks out his dangerous two bits. But he's young and reckless. And I know how he gets when he sees a way to grab a buck. I suppose his name gets around West Florida because one day a white man drives up to the house and makes a better offer. $1 a snake. Of course, he takes it. But when the white man who was only giving my father 50 cents shows up, he doesn't take kindly to the new arrangement. He curses my daddy out and threatens to return with the law. This is a story my father thinks is no big deal, really. Just the daily stuff he had to do to live down there. And I can see he's wondering why I want to make something of it. But when the white man comes back, hauling with him the sheriff, he gives me a description of my grandfather, a black man with a long handlebar mustache who owns his land and holds a certain reputation. When anger, we both stammer. Unlike me, no one cares to get him to that point. This is proven by the way my father says the sheriff decides to handle the situation. When the car pulls up, my grandfather stands in the front door. Tall, stout, with Indian blood, no matter. He's a quiet black man on his own land in the South in the late 20s or early 30s, holding a shotgun and saying nothing else. My father could never tell me what my grandfather did to earn this moment. What crazy, selfish, or fearful things which came before, which would lean the sheriff to his side against the wounded pride of a white Southern man. And I want to yell, as wind blowing dust across the front yard, watch your step into their ears. But they both know more than I do, that nothing's gonna happen, that they're all going to let the poor, silly man yell until his face turns red and he simply runs out of breath and insults. My daddy will never be able to tell me what it was about my grandfather that tells the sheriff, this just ain't worth the dance. Or what it is in my sister that recalls my granddad to the relatives who knew him. When my daddy was a young boy, he played with rattlesnakes. Can't you just hear Muddy Waters and Junior Walker juking that out? So baby, I sure know how to handle you. You know, I wish he had told me more, but you know, you take what you can get, right? And since we're talking about ancestors, I talked about Phyllis Wheatley. Ooh, come on, stop. And with Rowan, and the reason why I was talking about Wheatley is because I've been writing a cycle of poems about Wheatley. It's going to be turned into a dance music piece that I'm working on right now with some choreographers and producers up in Montreal. But I started off with the question. If you were here for the interview yesterday, I started off with the question that I asked Rowan that you can't answer. Was basically when Phyllis Wheatley's first book came out. It was published in England. She went over to England with one of the Wheatley family to supervise it. She was the toast of the town when the book came out. When the book was published, she had this moment where basically, you have to remember this, but at that moment, slavery was illegal in England. So the moment she stepped her foot on English soil, she was technically a free woman. But she went back. And a scholar, raised that question to me. Said, well, why do you think she went back? And I don't know the answer to that, but it started the cycle. And it was less about that question, the more about the idea of what happens when the slave learns the master's language. How does that change you? Because you got to remember that Phyllis Wheatley was captured when she was 6 or 7 years old. So she had a family, she had parents, she had language, she had a name, but she suppressed all of that and replaced it with English, with American, right? What would become American. So, and people talk about that one poem of hers, Coming to America from Africa, or however it is, whatever that title is. And they sort of overlook the fact that sprinkled all through that book is references to her days as a child, what she remembers, sprinkled all through the book. And this is one where it actually peaks to the top. The other question she asked me was like, how did Phyllis Wheatley's parents feel? And Wheatley actually writes about this. I wrote this poem is called To Phyllis Wheatley's Mother, and the epigraph is from a poem by Phyllis Wheatley about her parents. I, young in life, by seemingly cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs, excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breasts? Phyllis Wheatley. To Phyllis Wheatley's mother. They say your daughter is a rare orchid. She lives in a fancy house on a high street. They named her after the ship which bore her, wild, they claim, across the waves. They say your daughter is a cuckoo's egg. She walks the street in English garb. She did not fill the shark's belly. She does not sweep, hoe, or weed. She stood just once upon the block. Your daughter is as exotic as white pepper. She reads, she travels, and when she dreams, a clean head kisses a starched pillow. She can cradle the owner's spell book between her dark hands. She has learned to sing in robber's tongue. Your daughter's quill makes patriots blink. Her black skin, spooled parchment, poem, bill of sale. God has given her a kingdom you can hardly pronounce. Sometimes, in her famous book, a line will slip, and she is returned unrefined before Mrs. Wheatley scooped the sickly child, fed her broth, and bound books. Alas, my dusky mother, she writes, if only she knew the first note of mercy is pain. Wheatley in London. Her second voyage is kind. She steps down the gangplank onto English soil, American slave with her masters in tow, and a manuscript so outrageous no one in the colonies dare kiss it with ink. Her second voyage is paid for. The only thing that will bound her here are the free thoughts stitched into a spine. Here, the proof of her is no doubt. The arrow of the Lord wears a lady's crown and thrums the air with her rhymed liberation. The rich folk come from miles to touch the chattel hand that scratched out a book, to feel holy astonishment wash their ears. Dusky muse, wonder wheel, she speaks and her mind is fire. She speaks and mercy is a small, dark sparrow. Lexicon. The good Lord puts new sounds in the heathen's mouth. Holy is a word that burns the fingers as you cradle the book, a stern beard that plucks a child from her mother, a law that names you chattel, then blesses your soul. Turn the page and read a story about the skin you wear and what that mark earns you. Say faith, a veil of questions you get to pull back, perhaps, with your last breath. Roll it on your tongue, sickly girl. And then there's mercy. When you stood, shivering on the Boston dock, draped only in a dirty carpet, you had no words for what came towards you out of the wronged air. How your mind would lick that word like butter once you found it. Translation. This is the epigraph from June Jordan. Come to this country a slave, and how should you sing? How do you say this in Senegalese? My mother is gone. I dream my father calls my name, but I cannot fill his arms. The ship is a crazy beast. These irons cut my legs, and the air reeks of shit and piss. I am sick and thinning from hunger. What happens to me in this strange place? What is the tongue of this hostile tribe? New birds, cold air, narrow streets, hard and uneven to walk, slop and thirst on the tongue. If you scream your name and no one listens, if you yell where you come from and people stare through you, are you a girl or a ghost? What did Phyllis tell the Wheatleys that first day with them? Clothes, they say. Broth, they sing. Soap and water to soothe whatever she babbles. Two more from there. Then I'm going to close with some poems from Brutal Imagination. Three more, maybe. The thing about Phyllis Wheatley, and Rohan was talking about this briefly in our talk, is about how people sort of like decide what she is and what she isn't, and how good a poet she is, how bad a poet she is. Thomas Jefferson and Amiri Baraka are both in agreement that Phyllis Wheatley sucks. Each for various reasons, right? For Amir Baraka, it was that because she was, in his estimation, she wasn't militant enough, right? Which is kind of a silly thing to ask when you're, back in the colony days, and there's no Kavi Khanum, there's no Black Arts Movement, there's very few Black. Anyway, but there you go. And for Thomas Jefferson, here's this poem. God could not make her a poet. Thomas Jefferson said this, more or less, after he read the musings of the clever African Phillis Wheatley, a sensation of both the colonies and England, a black patriot, though a slave. Whatever a black hand can build, he knew, could only be guided by a master's vision. Like this room of the mansion he probably made his opinion in. What black mind could dream in these proportions and gather the slope of these Virginia hills so lovingly to his window? God could give her words, but the subtle turn, like giving a gull a sack of gold. Diabolic. Again, quotation from Phyllis's poem. Diabolic. Their color is a diabolic dye. What they say they are and what they actually do is what Phyllis overhears. It's like she isn't here. It's like she's a ghost at arm's length, hearing the living curse out the dead, which she's been led to believe no decent person does in a church. How they say they love her and how they look at her is what Phyllis observes, like she's the hole in the pocket after the money runs out. God loves everybody, even the sinner, they say. Even a mangy hound can rely on a scrap of meat scraped off the plate, they say. What they testify and what they whisper in earshot is as dark as her skin, whistled from opposite sides of a mouth. Is she the Bible's fine print? And finally, for this cycle, Phyllis, they actually had a trial to determine if she was really a poet. This actually happened. Before the book came out, the poems were coming out in broadsides and things like that, and finally they had to get a panel together to actually say this. I think John Hancock was one of the people there. Skip Gates has written a really small book about that, half imagination, half real, about what actually happened there. The trial of Phyllis Wheatley. She claims she wrote a book, but here's what could have happened. In order to make a point, to move things along, a rich white man in pre-revolutionary Boston decides to raise some abolitionist sand by pretending to be a young black female slave, burning with the good word, bristling with Alexander Pope. Maybe he owns a printing press. Maybe he's got some buddies to go along with the gag. Up and down the block fly the broadsides, between slugs of ale and church hymns, the panic of black verse. An alternative could be all of the above plus a young black female slave bearded to the cause. Teach her to recite, just enough. Petticoat her, just enough. An indentured rebel. Written by Phyllis Wheatley, a slave owned by John Wheatley, versed by Phyllis Wheatley, a teen Ethiop, late of Africa. If a Negro can write a poem, why not a fish then? Why not a cloud with feet? What is your name? A long way from home, sir. What is your tongue? Poetry and the breath of the Lord. What is your accent? A patriot, sir. It will take a jury of proper white men to prove this true. John Hancock to swear in ink this we saw. The paper, the quill, her black hand singing. I was going to read more from there, but I'm not going to press my luck with the win. So I'm going to finish off with some poems from Brutal Imagination. And people who don't know the story, it's about a young white mother, Susan Smith, who kills her two kids by strapping in the back of the family car and pushing into John D. Long Lake outside of Union, South Carolina. And then blaming the crime on an imaginary black man. And for 9 days, there was a national hunt for this imaginary guy before she actually broke down and confessed it was her. So the poem was written in the voice of the imaginary black guy to report about what that existence might have been like. It got turned into a play that Joe Morton starred in. And Joe is going to, we also did it as a enhanced reading during COVID for the Vineyard Theater. And it's probably going to be restaged at some point this year. It's also on Kindle. It's a Kindle version of it. Anyway. How I Got Born. Though it's common belief that Susan Smith willed me alive at the moment her babies sank into the lake. When called, I come. My job is to get things done. I am piecemeal. I make my living by taking things. So now a mother needs me clothed in hand-me-downs and a knit cap. Whatever. We arrive, bereaved on a stranger's step. Baby, they weep, poor child. My heart. Susan Smith has invented me because nobody else in town will do what she needs me to do. I mean, jump in an idling car and drive off with two sad and frightened kids in the back. Like a bad lover, she has given me a poisoned heart. It pounds both our ribs, black, angry, nothing but business. Since her fear is my blood and her need, part mythical. Everything she says about me is true. Who am I? Who are you, mister? One of the boys asked from the eternal back seat, and here is the one good thing. If I am alive, so too briefly are they. Two boys returned, 3 and 1, quiet and scared, bunched together, breathing like small beasts. They can't place me. Yet there's something familiar. Though my skin and sex are different, maybe it's the way I drive. Or occasionally glance back with concern. Maybe it's the mixed blessing someone, perhaps circumstance, has given us. The secret thrill of hiding, childish, in plain sight, seen but not seen, as if suddenly given the power to move through walls, to know every secret without permission. We roll through the dark streets, but inside the cab is lit with brutal imagination. Where am I? Looking for Michael and Alex means that the bushes have not whispered, but the trees hold only shade, that the lake still insists on being a lake. I flicker from TV to TV. My flyer sits on the grandmother's easy chair. I hover over so many lawns, so many cups of coffee. I pour from lip to lip. The town blossoms in yellow ribbons, sprinkled like breadcrumbs or bait. I crackle from cell phones and shortwave. I'm listed for in alleys. Looking for Michael and Alex means each car is scanned at the drive-through windows, that sightings are hoped for at the self-serve pumps. Clerks long for the crook of my arm, reaching for diapers and snacks. So many days I have loped from car, to ear, from beauty parlor to church. They count the days till someone comes back. We've never left. I'm going to jump ahead. Yep, okay. I'm going to do one more. Okay. I'm going to do one more, and this is the last poem. First part of the poem is handwritten confession of Susan Smith, and the response, the call and response, is the imaginary black guy. Birthing. When I left my home on Tuesday, October 25th, I was very emotionally distraught. I have yet to breathe. I am in the back of her mind, not even a notion, a scrap of cloth, the way a man lopes down the street. Later, a black woman will say, we knew exactly who she was describing. At this point, I have no language, no tongue, no mouth. I am not me yet. I am just an understanding. As I rode and rode and rode, I felt even more anxiety. Susan parks on a bridge and stares over the rail. Below her feet, a dark blanket of river she wants to pull over herself, children and all. I am not the call of the current. She is heartbroken. She gazes down and imagines heaven. I felt I couldn't be a good mom anymore, but I didn't want my children to grow up without a mom. I am not me yet. At the bridge, one of Susan's kids cries, so she drives to the lake, to the boat dock. I am not yet opportunity. I have never felt so lonely and so sad. Who shall be a witness? Bullfrogs, waterfowl. When I was at John D. Long Lake, I never felt so scared and unsure. I've yet to be called. Who will notice? Moths, dragonflies, field mice. I wanted to end my life so bad, and I was in my car, ready to go down that ramp into the water. My hand isn't her hand, panicked on the emergency brake. And I did go part way, but I stopped. I am not gravity, the water lapping against the gravel. I got out again and stopped. I then got out of the car. Susan stares at the sinking. My muscles aren't her muscles, burned from pushing. The lake has no appetite, but it takes the car slowly, swallow by swallow, like a snake. Why was I feeling this way? Why was everything so bad in my life? Susan stares at the taillights as they slide from here to hidden. I have no answers to these questions. She only has me after she removes our hands from our ears. Thank you.